Welcome to Raising the Bar. I am Ashley Vargas, and I help lifters feel more confident adding weight to their barbell. Hello, lifters, and welcome to episode number 2 of Raising the Bar. Today, we are going to be going into the benefits of adding variations to your barbell lifts, specifically your power lifts, so your squat, your bench press, and your deadlift. But these tips are really going to be applicable to Olympic lifters as well to help improve your clean and jerk and your snatch. Before we dive deep into that discussion, I do want to share a little story. So I was having a conversation with one of my bodybuilding buddies the other day. He's been bodybuilding for 8-9 years, something like that. He's been doing it for a while, and he's really good. But he was telling me that he was considering switching over to the competitive powerlifting world. And of course, I am 100% in support of this transition. If for no other reason, a powerlifting diet is so much better than a bodybuilding diet. But food aside, one of his biggest concerns about switching over was, and I'm going to quote him, the damage that lifting heavy every single week is going to do to his body, and like specifically concerned about his joints. And I laughed a little bit because there is a common misconception out there that powerlifters and strength athletes in general always train heavy. And keep in mind the term heavy is very relative. So heavy to a competitive powerlifter is going to mean something different to a non-trained strength athlete. So just keep that in mind. But powerlifters don't train in the upper range consistently. A very small portion of the training process is done at that, we'll call it 95, 97%. The bulk of our training is done between a 70 and 80% of our 1 rep max. And we utilize different variations such as, bands, chains, pauses, tempos in order to improve on the weak points of the lift and help to condition some of those sticking points. So if you are training at 90 to 97% of your 1 rep max on a weekly basis, please stop. It is an unsafe way to train. It's not sustainable. Definitely does not allow for proper recovery and is truly ineffective in gaining strength over time. If you are unfamiliar with Westside Barbell's conjugate training method, I highly recommend you do a little bit of research on it. It is a training method that I use for all of my competitive strength athletes. And I'm actually going to be doing a podcast episode on the conjugate method here in a couple weeks. So stay tuned for that. But I will post a link to the Westside Barbell website in my podcast notes. So you can do a little bit of research before that next podcast so you have a kind of a foundation as to what I'm going to be talking about. But anyway, they have a 20-80 rule. So which states that 20% of an athlete's training is comprised of their actual competitive lifts. So for an Olympic lifter, only 20% of their training is actually doing the snatch and the clean and jerk. For a power lifter, only 20% of their training is actually doing the squat, bench press, or the deadlift. And then 80% is going to be training everything else. So what does everything else mean? It means targeting those weak points, accessory movements in order to strengthen those particular weak areas, mobility, range of motion training, explosive power, whatever it may be, recovery even. So trying to get stronger at a squat, for example, does not require you to squat all the time. It requires you to squat sometimes so we can see where the particular weak points of the lift are, or where our technique is failing us. That way we can train that particular weak area. And then once we get back underneath the barbell, we can apply everything that we learned as far as technique and powering through those sticking points and apply it to that 90 to 95%. So with that all being said, speaking of the squat, the very first barbell variation that I'm going to talk about is the pause squat. So the pause squat is something that you don't need any equipment for other than your barbell. And it's something that all lifters, in my opinion, should be utilizing. So the pause squat is exactly what it sounds like. You squat and you pause at the bottom. I always recommend a controlled negative. So it doesn't necessarily have to be to tempo, but you do need to control that negative. You don't just want to drop to the bottom of the squat. So once you get to the bottom of the squat and you have that firm 2 count pause, a couple things are going to happen. One being time under tension. So time under tension is the amount of time muscles are placed under a weighted load, which over time is going to help to increase muscular recruitment. So in the case of the pause squat, the leg muscles are being placed under an isometric contraction with the resistance being at the bottom position. So the fast twitch muscles are going to start to fatigue while the slow twitch muscles are going to be recruited in order to take over stabilization of both the bar and the body. And then the fast twitch muscles are going to have to kick in again in order to power you out of the hole. So if you think about your competitive squat, there is no pause at the bottom of a competitive squat. So if you are training the pause and you are conditioning your muscles to really fire out of nothing with no momentum, no leverage, no nothing, um, when you are able to take that pause out and have a little bit of that momentum and leverage from the bounce at the bottom of the squat, you are going to notice a significant decrease in any sticking points within the ascent of the squat. So, highly recommend utilizing the pause squat in order to help to break past that sticking point. You're also going to notice that with the pause squat, you have a better ability to control and stabilize your weight. So keep in mind that unstable or uneven weight is always heavy weight. So the pause squat really targets the ability to hold that brace position. And it requires proper breathing and bracing techniques in order to stabilize at the bottom of the squat while being able to both control your descent and the ascent phase of the squat. So when you train this way and you have the ability to hold that moderately heavy weight over a longer period of time, being able to control and stabilize a heavier bar, let's say 100+%, if we're talking this is your third attempt at a powerlifting meet, it gives you the ability to have better control over that heavy weight through both the ascent and the descent of the squat. Let's transition into talking about the bench press. So the bench press arguably is the slowest progressing lift for most people. It has the most sticking points, and you're probably going to plateau on your bench press multiple times throughout your career. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. So the barbell variation that we're going to talk about today is going to be the banded bench press. And this consists of just adding two very thin bands to either side of your barbell and then completing your bench press as you normally would. So diving into that, we're going to talk a little bit about the mechanics of the banded bench press. So on the concentric push of the bench, adding the bands to either side of your barbell are going to urge you to press the barbell faster in order to complete the range of motion. Benching with bands also demands greater force at the top end of the motion, which is going to help in superior contraction. And then on the eccentric control of the bench press, adding the bands to the barbell is going to pull the weight at a faster velocity. And in order to stop that barbell from hitting the chest, the pectoral muscle recruitment is going to be key here, especially on that eccentric control. So over time, this is going to help to promote explosive power. And so we talked a little bit about the slow and the fast twitch muscles when we were going over the pause squat, and it applies here as well. So the primary reason behind the development of greater explosiveness is really the ability to activate those fast twitch muscles in the body. So the slow twitch muscles have greater endurance, but are really inferior when it comes to explosiveness. On the flip side, the fast twitch muscle fibers are going to have higher level of explosiveness, but lower when it comes to endurance. So adding the variation in resistance through the bands is really going to help with greater activation of those fast twitch muscle fibers and promote explosive power. So if you think about your competitive bench press, you're not going to have the varying resistance. It's just going to be that consistent weight all the way through. So we have to keep in mind that with our competitive bench press, we do have the pause at the bottom. But as you train and you develop those fast twitch muscle fibers, you are going to be able to explode off the chest a lot easier once you take those bands off, and you're going to have more speed in the eccentric phase of that bench press. So I highly recommend adding this in. Again, you don't want to train this at a very heavy weight. So I would say to start off somewhere between 68 and 72% of your one rep max, especially if you haven't tried this before. And then you can work your way up to that 75 to 77% as you get a little bit more consistent with it. The final barbell variation that we're going to talk about today is going to be the deficit deadlift. The deficit deadlift is probably one of the most effective deadlift variations that you can use. The increased length of the pull really helps to keep that body under tension for a longer period of time, which over time, as you train this particular variation, is going to provide faster speed off the floor and increased pulling power overall. Also, the abnormal starting position is really going to help to improve your form and execution once you take that back down to the floor and take out that deficit. So, when you're talking about deficit deadlifts, we don't have to be at a significant deficit. It really can just be 1 inch off the floor, and it's going to provide a ton of benefits as far as improving your deadlift overall. So, one of the biggest benefits is going to be an improved output off the floor. So, the deficit deadlift adaptation really exposes your bottom end weaknesses, even more due to the fact that it requires you to pull that extra range. So, once you can pinpoint that weakness, you can then adapt your training methods, or your coach can adapt those training methods to really work on improving the weak points of the pull, which over time is going to help to gain strength in that lift overall. It really helps to improve your leg strength as well. So, unlike a regular deadlift, and we're talking conventional here, not sumo. So, unlike a regular conventional deadlift, the deficit requires you to sink your hips a little bit lower in the starting position, which is going to create more flexion over the knee. So, as a result, to this little adjustment, the exercise really is going to activate your quads considerably more than it would in a regular deadlift just starting off the floor. So much so that it can be argued that the deficit deadlift is going to provide a similar quality to what a squat would in terms of quad activation. So it's really going to help to build leg strength overall. And especially if you're a lifter that has weaker legs, specifically quads, if you are not training and building those up, you're going to find that your hip extenders are going to take over in the deadlift. So training that deficit is going to help to alleviate that issue. Training this over time, you're also going to see improved lower back and hip strength. So when you're performing the deficit deadlift, your hips are going to be a little bit lower back than they typically would, which is a little bit more of a challenging starting position, and it requires the low back to cope with that increased range of motion. So, as a result, the exposure to that greater range, the muscles in the body are going to produce an increased level of contraction, subsequently becoming more resilient to that loaded barbell. Now that we've reviewed the 3 barbell variations, it's up to you, the lifter, to now put them into action. So, if you are a newer lifter, I'd recommend just picking one of these. Choose whatever lift you're struggling with the most right now, and implement that. So, if you're struggling with bench, try that banded bench press. If you are a more advanced lifter, you could probably tackle two during the same training block and be fine. But remember that these barbell variations are really a tool to help you push past some of those strength plateaus you might be facing. But also, they are great tools to help to identify and highlight some of the weak points in your lift. Um, Now, once you do identify what those weak points are, it's key to, really come up with a game plan and strategically think through what your accessory movements or your mobility movements or both need to be in order to isolate that particular weakness and train it to become a strength. So I always like to say that a lifter is only as strong as their biggest weakness. So we want to make sure that we are not only highlighting them and figuring out what they are, but training them so they are no longer holding us back and keeping kilos off of the platform. So I would love to know if you give any of these a try and see some success with it. So I'm going to be posting all of my social handles in the notes of this podcast. So once you do give them a try, please reach out to me and let me know how it goes. I would love to get feedback, and I will be chatting with all of you next Wednesday.